Welcome, we are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and today we are delving into Judaism, the Jewish text, because we've been pondering for quite a few months now that we should go back to the roots, the Jewish roots, and examine the text, learn them to better understand them, and then perhaps we'll be able to better understand Christianity and Islam, which emerged from them, from Judaism. So we found this book, The Wisdom of the Talmud, by Rabbi Bokser, who introduces the English reader to one of the great cultural treasures of mankind. For approximately 1,000 years, the great masters of Jewish thought grappled with the problem of man and his destiny. The enduring fruit of their labours is recorded in the vast literature of the Talmud. In the present volume, the author has culled the choicest material in Talmudic literature and has woven out of it a fascinating portrait of the Talmudic mind, its conceptions of God and of social ethics and personal morality, of law and general human wisdom. And all this is set in a larger survey of the times in which the Talmud grew and of the forces that shaped its dominant ideals. Presented in a lucid style, this book will explain why the Talmud has remained paramount in the history of Judaism and why it must be regarded as a major source of wisdom in the general history of human culture. And there's some information on Rabbi Bokser, how he was ordained and how he was qualified, what qualifications he had, and his service in the US Army in World War II as a chaplain. So here is the wisdom of the Talmud, 1,000 Years of Jewish Thought by Rabbi Bokser. Table of contents. Notes and index. Introduction. The literature of the Talmud represents approximately 1,000 years of Jewish thought. Its foundations were laid by the work of Ezra during the middle of the 4th century BCE in the community of the returned exiles from Babylonian, who inaugurated the second Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. Its period of greatest productivity came in the centuries that followed the disastrous Jewish war against Rome in 70 CE. The Talmud is not an independent literature, however. It proceeds instead as a supplement to the Bible. The Bible remained the fundamental source of belief and practice in Judaism, but the Talmud was its authoritative exposition and implementation. This is according to this rabbi. The position of the Talmud in Jewish life has been paramount. It was studied zealously by young and old alike, who found in it the authoritative word concerning the true meaning of Scripture. The lighter side of the Talmud, its parables, its ethical aphorisms, its legendary tales, delighted the common people. The more serious side, the subtle discussions of law, were a welcome outlet for the intellectual interests of the learned. The Talmud itself became a subject for new commentaries and super commentaries. Its study commenced in the elementary grades of the Jewish school, and it continued in even more subtle techniques of analysis into the highest grades of the rabbinical academies. The love for the Talmud among the Jewish masses finally created an institution of popular adult education, the voluntary study group that met on Sabbath and holiday afternoons and weekday evenings to enable the busy layman to continue his interest in Talmudic literature. We were just thinking, just pondering. A thought hit us. So going back to here, this rabbi, he lectured Jewish Theological Seminary, etc., etc. Was ordained a rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He received his doctorate in philosophy at Columbia University. So we're just thinking, has he been influenced by these at Columbia University? And here in this sentence, where he's saying the Talmud is not an independent literature, however, it proceeds instead as a supplement to the Bible. We were thinking, okay, so because of that, Columbian University sort of be influenced by the Christian religious section of it, or those theologians, etc. But then again, we just thought, well, he's probably saying in this sentence that the Bible is an influence to the Christians because it has these Judaic roots. That's probably what he's trying to say. Yeah, we think that's what he's trying to say. The most crucial element in the discussion of the Talmud is centered in law, for law figured prominently in the Bible, and the Talmud mirrors faithfully the text on which it is based. Yeah, why we're thinking that earlier idea was because he's mentioning the Bible. The Bible is a collection of 66 books or something, which includes the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that's where we thought he was hinting at, or that he was influenced by these Christian theologians who are not always Christians at that Columbia University. Anyway, carrying on. The most crucial element in the discussions of the Talmud is centered in law, for law figured prominently in the Bible, and the Talmud mirrors faithfully the text on which it is based. But the Talmud is not a code. It records varying opinions on law as on life, without always offering decisions as to which was to be deemed authoritative for posterity. The legal discussions of the Talmud are, however, an invaluable source book on Jewish law, for they preserve all the varying trends in the interpretation of biblical legislation. They likewise preserve a record of new developments in the law by which the Jewish community ordered its life. The codification of Jewish law was to be a labour of later generations. Utilising Talmudic discussions as the authority, a group of distinguished scholars, most of them active during the Middle Ages, endeavoured to codify the rabbinic law. The most widely used of these works is the Shulchan Aruch by Joseph Caro, 1488 to 1575. This code above all gained popular acceptance, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. But such distinguished teachers of Judaism as are Moses Isserles, Solomon Luria, Mordecai Jaffa, Samuel Edels, and Yom Tov Lipman Heller did not hesitate to dispute the authority of the Shulchan Aruch. Even as late as the 18th century, Rabbi Elijah ben Solomon, the Gaon of Vilna, though he had written a valuable commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, did not hesitate on occasion to ignore it and to decide cases on the basis of an original weighing of previous precedents and circumstances in the light of the original discussions in the Talmud. The rise of the Talmud to its dominant role in Jewish life was not without challenge. Its authority was rejected by a group of Babylonian Jews led by a certain Anan ben David in the middle of the 8th century. They organized a sect known as the Karaites, from Kara, the study of scripture. Karaites. Yeah, what's that, Karaites? Yeah, it must be Karaites, the study of scripture, because Kara means the study of scripture, and ites is people, so people who study the scriptures, which sought to center Judaism on the sole authority of the Bible. Fierce polemics developed between the Karaites and the Rabbinites, as the defenders of Talmudic authority were called. The Karaites have persisted as a small sect, and several thousand of them still exist in scattered communities in various parts of the world. A Karaite settlement of some 500 souls has recently been started in the state of Israel, all of them immigrants from Cairo, Egypt. They have been included in Israel's current effort as an effort to ingather the exiles, and they have been recognized as an independent community, free to order life in accordance with its own distinctive interpretations of Judaism. The non-Jewish world has given the Talmud a mixed reaction. In the Middle Ages, when religious disputations were popular, the Talmud became a frequent subject of controversy. The Talmud was subjected to a variety of criticisms because the Talmud had permitted itself to adapt old institutions that they might be more relevant to the needs of a later age. It was charged with the falsification of the Bible. Because the Talmud often speaks in parables, it was disparaged as absurd, as abounding in fairy tales. Because the Talmud reflects a healthy respect for bodily life and speaks with frankness about sex, contrary to the asceticism of the Middle Ages, it was denounced as sensuous and unspiritual. Perhaps the most serious charge against the Talmud was that it is irreverent toward the beliefs and practices of the Church. The Talmud arose during the epoch when Christianity began its secession from Judaism, and when the Christians were looked upon as dissident Jews. Against that background, there must have been extensive controversy between the adherents of traditional Judaism and the advocates of the new doctrine. The Talmud generally avoids polemics, but some echoes of that controversy survive in the Talmud. Principally a prayer against sectarianism, the prayer Ve'lamalshinim, as it is known in the present Jewish liturgy. This now became a cause of serious charges against Judaism, above all against the revered classic, the Talmud. The animosity towards the Talmud was often instigated by renegades from Judaism who exhibited their converts' customary zeal by a vilification of the faith they had deserted. The apostate Nicholas Donin laid before Pope Gregory IX the charge that the Talmud was a pernicious and blasphemous work. The Pope responded with an order to seize all copies of the Talmud for an inquiry into their content. In consequence of this agitation, 24 cartloads of Hebrew books and manuscripts were publicly burned in Paris on June 17, 1242. In the 16th century there were 6 burnings of Talmudic books in 1553, 1555, 59, 66, 92 and 1599. A Christian censorship of Hebrew books was instituted in 1562. Most editions of the Talmud now extant still carry the censor's assurance that these volumes are free of offensive material. There were voices in the Jewish community that spoke out in defense of the Talmud. Some defended the particular passages of the Talmud which had been attacked. Others addressed themselves to the larger issue involved. They spoke out boldly for religious freedom. One of the most courageous pleas for freedom came from Rabbi Judah Loet of Prague, 1512 to 1609. After analysing the usual charges against the Talmud in detail and refuting them, he adds, "One ought not reject the words of an opponent. It is preferable to seek them out and study them. Thus shall a person arrive at the full truth. Such words should not be suppressed, for every man of valour who wants to wrestle with another and to show his strength is eager that his opponent shall have every opportunity to demonstrate his real powers. But what strength does he show when he forbids his opponent to defend himself and to fight against him? Therefore it is wrong to suppress anyone who wants to speak against religion and to say to him, 'Do not speak thus.' The very converse is true. This itself weakens religion. Suppose the Talmudists did speak against Christian doctrine, expressing publicly what was in their hearts. Is this an evil thing? Not at all. It is possible to reply to them. The conclusion of the matter is that it would be most unworthy to suppress books in order to silence teachers." And looks like there might be a footnote here, indication, or maybe it's at the back of the book in the index. The rise of modern anti-Semitism gave fresh impetus to the attacks against the Talmud. The father of the modern calumnies upon the Talmud was the German polemicist John Andreas Eisenmenger, 1654 to 1704. Eisenmenger offered to suppress his work Indictis Judentum, Jury Unmasked, for a consideration of 30,000 florins, but the Jews refused to be blackmailed into paying the sum. The book has been described as a collection of scandals by the Allgemeine Deutsche Bibliographie, an official encyclopedia of German bibliography, published by the German Imperial Academy of Science in 1876. Some passages, the appraisal continues, are misinterpreted, some distorted, others are insinuations based on one-sided inferences. The most spectacular campaign against the Talmud was led by August Rowling, 1839 to 1931, a professor of Hebrew antiquities at the University of Prague. His Dear Talmud Yudah, the Talmud Jew, went through 17 editions, reaching a circulation of 200,000 copies in Austria alone. Rohling repeatedly prefaced his slanderous material with the offer of 1,000 thaler if Judah managed to get a verdict from the German Association of Orientalists that the quotations were fictitious and untrue. The challenge was taken up by Joseph S. Bloch, rabbi at Floridsdorf, and later a member of the Austrian Parliament, who offered 3,000 thaler if Rohling could prove that he was able to read a single page of the Talmud chosen at random by Rohling himself. Accusing Rohling of ignorance and perjury, Bloch dared him to bring a libel suit. Because of his professional standing, Rohling could not evade the issue and finally charged Bloch with libel before a Vienna magistrate. The court was anxious to make a thorough study of the subject and requested the rector of the University of Vienna, Hofrat Zog, by the looks of it, and the German Association of Orientalists to appoint 2 experts. It conceded to Rohling's request that both these experts be full-blooded Christians. Were they supposed to convert? Or were they supposed to be Christians that were going up against this guy? And so forth. Another such Talmud authority was Aaron Bremen, alias Dr. Justice. He was born a Jew and had aspirations for a career as a Jewish scholar, but when he lost face with the Jewish community for deserting his wife and children, he became a Protestant. Subsequently, he became a Catholic and then a Protestant again, and finally tried to return to Judaism. Toward the end of his career, he once again joined the Catholic Church. His principal work, published anonymously, was Der Judenspiegel, the Mirror of the Jew, a compilation of 100 laws taken from the Shulchan Aruch and purporting to show the Jewish animosity towards Christians, or the dislike or the hatred. In a book about the Kabbalah, which Bremen subsequently wrote under his true name, he said that the whole anti-Semitic literature, including the Judenspiegel, his own work, had been written by stupid and ignorant men. In 1885 he was sentenced by a Vienna court to a long term in prison and expulsion from Austria for forgery of documents. Professor Franz Delitzsch, the famous Protestant theologian, pronounced the Judenspiegel a concoction of damnable lies. Following his expulsion, Bremen took up medical studies in Paris. These same forgeries of Justice Bremen were later published by another adventurer, Jacob Ecker, who offered them as his own work under the title The 100 Laws of the Jewish Catechism. Tsarist Russia made its contribution to this gallery of literary swindlers in the person of the notorious Justin Pranaitis, a Catholic clergyman. His monograph, The Christian and the Jewish Talmud, was based on the work of Eisenmenger and Rohling. To create the impression of authenticity, he cites many passages in the original Hebrew and Aramaic, but they are all lifted from Eisenmenger, errors and misprints included. By identifying as references to Christians and Christianity such epithets in the Talmud as ha'aretz, literally a peasant but more generally an illiterate person, a pagan or idol worshipper, a pikoros, Epicurean, but applied to heretics generally, and Kuthim, the Samaritans, he proves widespread prejudice on the part of his Talmud toward Christianity, and so forth. Talmudic literature went through a long and varied development. The earliest layer of the Talmud is the Mishnah, product of Palestinian scholarship and written in a clear, lucid Hebrew. The later expository supplement known as the Gemara, which elucidates the Mishnaic text, was developed during the 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries when the centers of Jewish population was shifting from Palestine to Babylonia. Paralleling the Palestinian Gemara, there also arose a Babylonian Gemara, produced by the newer academies of Babylonia. Both Gemaras were written in the Aramaic vernaculars, then current in Babylonia and Palestine. So these Aramaic vernaculars would have been a Neo-Aramaic, a new Aramaic derivative, a modernized or a modern Aramaic language, possibly Syriac or something like that. The Talmud has survived in both traditions, the Babylonian and the Palestinian, in the essential procedures and in the underlying doctrines. The two Talmuds are similar, but there are so many significant differences between them, reflecting in many instances the differing conditions under which the two communities carried on their work. Thus the Palestinians felt themselves in their own country, and they regarded the Roman authorities as exercising their power without moral sanction. They therefore ruled the publicans, who as tax collectors had collaborated with the enemy, as reprobate, and they refused to extend any credence to their testimony in a court of law. The Babylonians, on the other hand, demanded scrupulous adherence to the law of the land, and the tax collector was for them only a civil servant performing his duty, who was as honourable as any other man. It was in its Babylonian version that the Talmud became so influential a force in Jewish life. The Palestinian Talmud, on the other hand, made but a slight impression on the Jewish world. The circumstances that led to a preference for the Babylonian Talmud have been variously defined. The Babylonian academies functioned under conditions of greater stability and peace, and the discussions which emanated from them reveal a greater measure of lucidity and order. What was perhaps more decisive, however, was the fact that the Babylonian Jewish community had overshadowed the Jewish community of Palestine as a centre of culture and world influence. As Dr. Louis Ginsberg puts it, the Babylonians were more successful in establishing the authority of the Talmud in European countries. This success was largely due to the fact that Babylonia, under the rule of the Abbasids, became the centre of Arabic culture, and consequently of Jewish culture, since a majority of Jews then lived in Islamic countries. There is a splendid English translation of the Mishnah published in 1933 by Reverend Herbert Danby, Canon of Christ Church and Regius Professor of Hebrew at the University of Oxford, England. There is a German translation of the Babylonian Talmud by Lazarus Goldschmidt. The Palestinian Talmud is available in a French translation by M. Schwab. The Soncino Press in London had recently published a new translation of the Babylonian Talmud in English under the very competent editorship of Dr. I. Epstein. There's some more information here. It carries on here. The Talmud as literature. In the library of the world's literary classics, a place of special distinction belong to the approximately 40 volumes which are designated collectively by the name Talmud. Formidable in size, written in a difficult Aramaic, elusive in many of its discussions, the Talmud has long been an enigma to many. Can the average reader get some idea of what this vast literature is all about? Of the men who produced it? Of the ideas which inspired them? Can we open a window to permit the modern reader to behold the world of the Talmud, its culture, its way of life? The authors of the Talmud did not look upon their teaching as an esoteric doctrine suited only for the few. They sought to reach all men. They sought to reach the common people no less than the professional scholars. The traditional system of Jewish education began the study of the Talmud in the middle grades of the elementary school and continued it on ever deepening levels of analysis to the academies of highest learning. And one of the objectives of that educational system was to cultivate in the student a taste for the Talmud that was to make of its study his avocation throughout life. Its very name Talmud derives from the Hebrew lomud, which means study, suggests that it was meant to be a rich and fruitful field of knowledge and research. The prize of the knowledge of the Talmud can be found, but it requires toil, it requires disciplined study. Those who are ready to pursue it with the necessary diligence will find awaiting them a treasury of rare wisdom to reward their labours. The Talmud came into being as a supplement to biblical Judaism. It was intended to bridge the gap between the Bible and life. It was a new creation of the Jewish people in response to the facts of a changing world that could no longer be guided by the simple word as enunciated in the biblical text. The Bible requires supplementation. The Bible continues to command the reverent loyalty of Jews and of countless others who have learned to look upon it as the embodiment of their basic religious beliefs and moral ideas. But the very effort to make biblical religion the basis of human living exposes its insufficiency, at least for those who live in another milieu than the one in which the Bible took form. The biblical text often needs clarification. The Bible, for instance, allows the termination of marriage through divorce, without, however, defining the grounds for divorce, the procedure by which it was carried out, or the fate that was to befall the children of the dissolved family. The Bible similarly prohibits work on the seventh day of the week, but it does not define what is meant by work. Are we to infer that writing a letter, marketing, or preparing food is to be construed as work? Must the country's armed services go off duty on the Sabbath? Was the priest to halt his temple duties, and must the rabbi suspend teaching and preaching? Was healing the sick work, and must it be discontinued on the Sabbath? The answers to these questions must have been common knowledge at the time biblical law was formulated, but in the course of the centuries that body of unrecorded knowledge was forgotten, and those provisions of the Bible were therefore in need of clarification. The Bible, moreover, could not have anticipated the specific solutions to the many varied problems created by the altered circumstances of a changing Jewish society. The Bible forbids idolatry as a major sin. When the Jews were drawn into the Roman Empire, they were confronted with the civic duty enforced among all Roman subjects of worshipping the emperor. Were they to yield or incur the consequences of disobedience to Rome? The ritual for initiating a proselyte into Judaism included the offering of a sacrifice at the Temple of Jerusalem, but how was that to be carried out after 70 CE when the temple was destroyed? That was no academic problem, for in the first century large numbers of pagans continued to join the synagogue throughout the Roman world. Indeed, how was Jewish religious life generally to be conducted after the fall of the temple, when so much of traditional Jewish piety had centered in the sacrificial cult and the various ceremonies surrounding it? The changes in Jewish society which necessitated the supplementation of the Bible were not only political, they were also cultural and social. The law that decreed an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, Exodus 21:23, as a principle in the punishment of crime, represented justice at the time of its enactment, but it seemed morally reprehensible to sensitive men of a later generation. The prohibition of lending money on interest implies a primitive agricultural economy where money is generally borrowed for the purchase of necessary tools or consumer goods. It is, however, incompatible with the complex requirements of a commercio-industrial economy which depends on investments and banking. Similarly, reflecting the rural society to which it originally addressed itself, the Bible has no explicit provision for a legal instrument validating a commercial transaction. In the absence of a specifically formulated law, local custom, or minhag, as it was called, often developed to take its place. It is clear, however, that the law could not abdicate to popular improvisation. If the law was to discipline life, it had to be enriched and supplemented with new provisions to keep pace with a changing world. Biblical narratives, too, present various theological, historical, and linguistic problems that had to be coped with if people were to master biblical study and continue to find in Scripture a source for guidance and authority in their religious life. How, for example, was the biblical appraisal of the world as very good, Genesis 1:31, to be reconciled with the experiences of evil and death and the repeated disasters to men championing good causes? With whom did God consult when he was quoted as saying, "Let us make man in our image"? Genesis 1:26. Does that mean that there are several divine powers, or that God is corporeal and endowed with a concrete image? If Moses was responsible for the writing of the biblical text, how explain the last 8 verses of Deuteronomy, which describe his death and extol the quality of his leadership? The Bible, finally had not exhausted the creative genius of the Jewish people. The same creative powers which produced those literary masterpieces of the Bible remained alive in the Jewish community and continued to stir men to see new visions and to incarnate them in new creations of culture. The Bible never became obsolete. Elements of abiding truth shine through all its pronouncements, even when they bear upon them some of the limitations of the people who laboured to give the Bible literary form and of the age in which it arose. But the Bible needed a commentary to close the gap formed by the passing of generations. People who have revered the Bible as the revealed will of God and have sought to live by its mandate have therefore generally felt the need of writing commentaries on it. The most imposing of these commentaries is the vast literature of the Talmud. The characterization of the Talmud as a commentary on the Bible describes the circumstances of its origin as well as its essential quality. But we must understand the term commentary in its broadest sense. It is more than a new exposition of an old document. It is also an original new creation, a means by which the voices of a new age speak out in their discoveries of new truth. That they are willing to speak through a commentary to an older work dramatizes a sense of unbroken continuity with their own past and the acceptance of the Bible as the all-sufficient work.